It's great to be here, and it's a great honor. It's a great honor to follow my good friend Ray Raymond. Ray and I have known each other for many years. How many heard Ray when? Oh, I'm in trouble. Okay. Ray is a wonderful guy. They don't make two Rays. There are not two Rays in this world. There's only one. He's a wonderful guy. And I will try to live up to the obviously excessive billing that he has provided for me. To talk to you tonight a little bit about American leadership in a world that is bewilderingly different than the one that certainly my generation grew up in, and the one, I think, fundamentally different in many ways than the one that's portrayed on most of the media in this world. I want to do two things tonight. I want to talk about how the world has fundamentally changed in terms of America's relationship to it, and the challenges that we have, and I want to talk a little bit about what it means to be a leader, a word that gets thrown around a lot. That we're a global leader. What does that mean? And are we really? And then I want to leave a lot of time, as much as I can, and this is where I suggest to you, to give you the false illusion that I'm going to pay attention to time by taking my watch off. I want to leave a lot of time to talk about whatever's on your mind, because there is an incredible array of issues that challenge us in this world. The president's recent trip, his first real foray abroad in the midst of daunting economic challenges and so on. Here's the punchline. We are undergoing in this world a fundamental revolutionary change in the structure of international politics, the nature of political power, of state power, the nature of the actors within the international system, how we interact with each other, what relative power means, to what are we vulnerable, what are the measuring rods by which we measure state behavior, what are the fundamental things by which we actually motivate ourselves to do things within this world. This world is undergoing a fundamental revolutionary change. I don't believe, and I suspect this is true as anyone lives through any revolutionary period, you don't really imagine until you look a bit in the rearview mirror how revolutionary it is. But I'm going to suggest to you that it is even more revolutionary than we might imagine. And what that does is that it changes fundamentally the context in which U.S. power, U.S. leadership is imagined, conceived, exercised. What does it even mean? Because I'm not sure I know what it means anymore. How many of you have heard the expression, America is a global leader? Yeah. You don't have to get too, those few occasions when presidential candidates actually talk about foreign policy. The premise is that American leadership is what is and what should be. And yet, and I'm not suggesting that it shouldn't be, what I'm suggesting is we need to understand what it is and what it isn't. Let's take you back to the context of American 20th century leadership. And it wasn't global leadership. We didn't lead the whole world. We led parts of it. World War I. We had an opportunity to lead. We were dragged in. Woodrow Wilson is remarkable because he mobilized the United States long about the end of the third quarter in that football game to join the game in the fourth quarter, tip the balance in our favor, and then go home. And there was this notion of a League of Nations, and there was a notion of a Treaty of Versailles, and there was a notion of a whole lot of different ways of doing things, 14 points, self-determination, a world that was in which most of the world's great empires, those that were left, fell apart. And how would we order that world? At the end of that war, we were the only one left standing. Every other participant in that war of any stature at all had had its population totally blown out. You can look at demographic charts of British, French, German, Russian populations from the early 20th century and see the male population carved out of those demographic charts, just like somebody taking a slice out of your Thanksgiving turkey. That's how fundamentally debilitating, economically, politically, socially, and culturally, that war was. The United States was the only country that could lead, and we chose not to. And we went home. We actually didn't go home entirely. We ended up actually doing, we called it a bailout today. Then it was 1923, it was called the Dawes Plan. We paid for all the reparations bills for Germany to stabilize German economy. You know all the stories in 1923 when you would carry wheelbarrows of money, of Reichsmarks around and buy your meal at lunch, because if you waited till dinner, it was doubling in price. That was 1923. It wasn't 1929. And we stabilized the German currency. We stabilized Europe. We tied it to our economy. Sound familiar? Sound a little bit like globalization? We tied it to our economy. Then we went into the Great Depression of 1929 and took Europe back down with us. And everybody said, oh, here we go again. And that led to, in many ways, that prompted many of the circumstances that gave rise to the Nazis in 1933 and so on and so on and so on. So arguably, the failure of America to actually lead in the wake of World War I simply meant that World War II was inevitable. Well, we didn't wait till the fourth quarter in World War I or in World War II, but we did wait a few years. And indicative of America's lack of desire to engage was the fact that while he was helping Britain through Lend-Lease and a lot of clandestine intelligence sharing and a lot of other under-the-table support, President Franklin Roosevelt was afraid that if Congress knew what he was really doing in 1940, he would be subject to impeachment. That's how strong our isolationism was in 1940. Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Germany declared war on us. We declared war on everybody, and off we were to the races. And by the end of 1942, we had really turned the tide in both theaters of war. Took another few years to wrap it up. It was bloody, much more bloody for everybody else than it was for us. And yet again, in 1945, we emerged from that war. We were the only one that really hadn't been depleted. It took us 2 years to decide that we would lead, but we did. And it was under the doctrine of containment. It was a defensive strategy. We found ourselves in the wake of World War II with a bipolar world. Not because we wanted to create a bipolar world, but because the Soviet Union, notwithstanding its political and economic weakness, was physically present in Eastern Europe with a whole bunch of troops and tanks, and we could not dislodge them. We did not want to dislodge them. George Patton wanted to dislodge them. It would have been a mess. We didn't. We tried to work with the Soviets. It didn't work, so we ended up acceding to a line down the middle of Europe, which became politicized and militarized and lasted for another half century, almost 45 years. It was a bipolar world. We led. What did we lead with? Our military power. We provided a security umbrella in a world that was more than anything else insecure. We provided a political commitment to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949, an unprecedented American commitment to the security of somebody else in peacetime. It was to deter. We made that political commitment. We thought in the 1940s the political commitment would be enough. We ended up having to back it up with nuclear weapons and troops and money and everything else. And it became a commitment that continues to this day. Economic resources through the Marshall Plan, and in Asia, we basically said to South Korea after the Korean War, and certainly to Japan, don't worry about a military. Put your focus on economic resources and developing your society, and therein lay the roots of Japan and South Korea's economic miracles. and as well as Taiwan later, and so on and so on. Because they didn't have to worry about defense. They could invest more in their economy. And they were able to join a trade system. In fact, we set the rules. It wasn't just our power and our money and our commitments, but we made the rules. We shaped the United Nations. We built the Bretton Woods system. We built the foundations of the World Bank and the IMF and the other international institutions, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We built the rules of a post-World War II system that we managed. We were chairman of the board, and we had most of the chips. What held that together? A couple of things. One, fundamental dependency. We didn't always get our way. I worked in the U.S. mission to NATO in the mid-1980s. We didn't always get our way with the Allies, but it was still the case, even in the last years of the Cold War, it was still the case that we could walk into the halls of the NATO alliance and said, hey, on agenda item number 2 and number 5, we need it to come out this way. And the Allies would say, oh, okay, okay. We were the Godfather. There's a wonderful little book, by the way. If you haven't read it, it's about 88 pages, so you can, do it easy. It's called The Godfather Doctrine. It's just been published by friends of mine, John Holtzman and Wes Mitchell. And for those of you, maybe this is a different generation, but for those of you who are aficionados of the movie The Godfather, you'll enjoy it. It's a nice little parable about American foreign policy. But we were the Godfather. We set the rules. We had the power. We had all the goodies. So they were dependent upon us. There was also a moral fiber to that. We were largely shaped by common values, Western values. And in the case of Japan, deference to our values because of the particular culture that gave rise to the Japanese Constitution and in our occupation. And we did set a tradition that was unique historically. We were a benign hegemon. Unlike most historic hegemons, we didn't bash our enemies. We brought them into the fold. It is not an accident that for the past 60 years, that the two of the strongest allies of the United States were our bitter adversaries in World War II. It's a particularly American way of dealing with that. Unlike others who wanted to cripple those economies and cripple those societies with reparations and other punitive measures. But there's an important part of all of this, and that it was still a status quo orientation. We led a coalition of allies, of shared values, largely speaking, building within this world of rules a system that was designed to keep things relatively as they were in the face of a power that was revisionist and wanted to change it. The Soviet Union, the communist system in general, wanted a different set of political rules, a different set of economic rules, a different set of values within societies, and wanted to expand those values in the system. Our strategy of containment and deterrence was fundamentally defensive. This is important because we weren't leading a change in international relations. And the contrast with more recent history is startling. One of the interesting symptoms of that was that when you think about America's military incursions and wars, battles, conflicts, whatever you want to call them, where I came in Southeast Asia. But you think about all the wars that we fought that were hot, all the wars we didn't fight because they were cold. We never had a plan to go occupy the other guy. In Vietnam, we never had a plan to occupy Hanoi. We never had a plan to invade North Vietnam. Our position in Vietnam was to say to the North, go home, leave the South to its alone. After the Korean War, it was to maintain that line, you stay on your side, we stay on ours. If there was ever going to be a war in Europe, it was not going to involve the physical occupation by NATO, the attempt to occupy Prague or Warsaw, or much less, Minsk or Kiev or Moscow. Because if we ever went to war, it would all be a smoking, radiating ruin, in the words of a 1947 national security document. And now think about that. When you fast forward to the 21st century and think about our attempts to occupy countries like Afghanistan and Iraq, you realize that we hadn't actually tried to occupy anybody in a long time, and we didn't know how. Because we were in the business of being a status quo power. Now, what did this create? A lot of good things. It created a world in which less than 15%, by the end of the Cold War, in which less than 15% of the world's population owned over 85% of the gross domestic product of the planet. This is a small, elite little club, ladies and gentlemen, and we were chair of the board. By the way, that also meant we consumed 85% of what the planet produced, and we also accounted for at least 85% of the pollution on the planet. But that's okay. It was sustainable because it was only 15% of us. So it was okay. It's like throwing a gum wrapper on the ground. It's okay until you have a billion gum wrappers. One you can kind of ignore. That all ended. 1989, Berlin Wall falls down. End of the Cold War. And I keep reminding my board of directors who cut their teeth in the Cold War that the high school students I work with now were born after the wall went down, so they don't quite understand it the way we do. About 5 years ago, the National Intelligence Council produced a document called Global Trends 2020. If you want to Google it, that's a verb now. If you want to Google it, it's NIC 2020. There's also an NIC, a Global Trends 2025. I'll talk about that in a second. But the first sentence in that 2020 Trends document is quite interesting. At no time since the formation of the Western Alliance system in 1949 have the shape and nature of international relations, of international alignments, been in such a state of flux. And what does that mean? Does it mean the world is changing? No, we knew that. What it says is that the very architecture of the international system has changed. You know that world we created at the end of World War II? Fundamentally different. We'll all remember the conversations over the last 5 years, generally centered around debates about the war in Iraq, about, oh yeah, they're our allies, snicker, snicker, snicker. Well, the fact of the matter is that the words ally, adversary, friend, partner, competitor have totally different meanings in the 21st century, and actually post-1990, than they did in the Cold War. It isn't the case that we walk in the halls of NATO and can say, excuse me, on agendas item 2 and 5, we really needed to come out that way. Because in the midst of the Cold War, the threat that the United States might actually pick up and go home was unacceptable. Today, you could argue, we could come to some accommodation about that. That maybe it's at least as much in our interest to remain engaged in Europe as it is for them, in their interest for us to remain engaged. It's a different kind of relationship, and that one-way dependency is gone.